At 9:27 a.m. on December 13th, 1943, the sky over Assam, India, was a canvas of pale blue and uncertainty. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair, just 23, circled high above Denjan Airfield in his P-40 Warhawk, eyes narrowed against the morning glare. Then out of the haze they appeared, first as glints of sunlight, then as a wall of silver wings. 64 Japanese aircraft, bombers, and fighters stacked in disciplined layers, advancing with mechanical precision toward the vulnerable Allied base below. 14C, 47 transports, loaded with supplies for front, sat exposed on the runway. A field hospital, fuel stores, and the lives of over 100 men depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Adair's heart pounded. He was alone. No wingman, no backup, no hope of reinforcements before the enemy struck. The radio crackled with static. Friendly fighters were nearly 40 minutes away, too far to help. Doctrine was clear: never engage when outnumbered, especially not 64-1. The manual said to wait, to survive, to let the odds pass by. But Adair knew what the manual didn't. If he waited, everything below would be lost. He checked his ammunition. 6.50 caliber Brownings, enough for 12 seconds of fire. He checked his fuel. Full tanks, but time was running out. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to live to fight another day. But something deeper, a stubborn sense of duty, a refusal to let history be written by the enemy, kept him circling, watching, daring to believe there might be a way to change the impossible. What happened next would defy every rule, every expectation, and every prediction. In the next 17 minutes, Adair would attempt a maneuver so reckless, so unthinkable, that it would leave both friend and foe speechless. But to understand why this moment mattered, and why the odds were so overwhelming, you have to know what was really at stake in the skies over India that winter. In 1943, Northeast India was more than a distant outpost. It was a lifeline of the Allied war effort in Asia. The region's airfields, carved from jungle and mud, serve as the launching points for the legendary Hump airlift, a perilous supply route over the Himalayas into China. Every day, American and Allied pilots braved treacherous weather, towering peaks, and enemy fire to deliver fuel, ammunition, and food to Chinese forces resisting the Japanese advance. Without these flights, the Chinese front would collapse, and with it, the hope of keeping Japan's armies tied down on the Asian mainland. Denjan Airfield, where Adair now circled, was one of the most critical links in this chain. Its runways were crowded with 47 transports, each one loaded with cargo that could mean the difference between survival and defeat for soldiers hundreds of miles away. The field hospital treated the wounded from recent battles, while fuel stores kept the airlift running day and night. Every crate, every drum, every flight mattered. But the Japanese knew this too. Their strategy was simple: cripple the airfields, destroy the transports on the ground, and sever the supply line. In the previous 2 months alone, Japanese raids had destroyed nearly 50 Allied aircraft and killed over 100 personnel in northeast India. Each attack sent shockwaves to the Allied command, forcing them to spread their already thin fighter defenses even thinner. Most believed the airfields were well protected, that the presence of a few fighters and anti-aircraft guns would be enough to deter or repel any attack. But the reality was far more precarious. The vast distances, unpredictable weather, and limited resources meant that, more often than not, only a handful of pilots stood between the Japanese and total devastation. The enemy's bombers and fighters could appear with little warning, overwhelming defenses before help could arrive. This was a hidden vulnerability, a gap in the armor that the Japanese were determined to exploit. And on this December morning, as 64 enemy planes bore down on Denjan, that vulnerability was about to be tested like never before. For Adair, the stakes were clear. If he failed, the entire Allied effort in China could unravel. And as the enemy formation closed in, the weight of that responsibility pressed down harder than ever. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was not the kind of man who sought the spotlight. Born in a small town in Ohio, he grew up with the steady hands and quiet confidence of a farm boy, learning to fix engines before he drive them. When war came, he volunteered for the Army Air Forces, driven by a sense of duty and a restless desire to see the world beyond the fields he'd always known. Training in the States had been grueling, but Adair's mechanical instincts and calm under pressure set him apart. In the cockpit, he was methodical, never reckless, always thinking 2 moves ahead. His instructors called him steady, never the flashiest, but the one you wanted on your wing when things went wrong. By the time he reached India, Adair had flown more than 40 combat missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron. The men he flew with were more than comrades. They were brothers forged by shared danger and sleepless nights. They joked about home, swapped stories over 10 cups of coffee, and watched each other's backs in the air. Adair was the youngest in his flight, but his reliability had earned him quiet respect. He was the one who checked every bolt, who listened for the subtle change in engine pitch, who never left a job half done. Yet beneath the calm exterior, the weight of responsibility pressed on him. The losses had been mounting. Friends shot down, transports destroyed, missions that ended with empty bunks in the barracks. Each time he signed off on a pre-flight check or watched a fellow pilot taxi out, he wondered if he'd see them again. The war in India was a war of attrition, and every day the odds seemed to tilt further against them. On the morning of the attack, Adair felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had slept little, haunted by the memory of the last raid and the faces of those who hadn't returned. As he climbed into Lulu Bell, his battered P-40, he ran his hands over the controls, grounding himself in the ritual. Alone in the sky, he carried not just his own fate, but the hopes of his squadron, the wounded in the hospital below, and the fragile lifeline that kept China in the fight. The threat that morning was unlike anything Adair or any pilot at Denjan had ever faced. 64 Japanese aircraft, a force designed to overwhelm, not just attack. 24 Mitsubishi Ki, 21 Sally bombers, each capable of carrying over 2,000 pounds of explosives, flew in tight, disciplined V formations. Above and below them, 40 Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar fighters formed a living shield, their pilots handpicked for aggression and skill. The bombers' mission was clear: obliterate Denjan Airfield, destroy the transports, and sever the Allied supply line. The fighters' job was simpler still: ensure no Allied pilot survived long enough to interfere. Adair's P-40 Warhawk, Lulu Bell, was a rugged machine, but it was never designed for odds like these. The Warhawk was fast in the dive and could take punishment, but it was heavier and less agile than the nimble Oscars. In a turning fight, the P-40 would bleed speed and become an easy target. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns packed a punch, but with only 12 seconds to sustain fire, every burst had to count. The P-40's Allison engine was reliable, but it struggled in the thin air above 15,000 feet, and the Japanese formation was approaching at altitude, where the Warhawk performance edge vanished. Standard doctrine was blunt: never engage superior numbers head-on. The manual drilled it into every pilot: wait for reinforcements, attack from advantage, never get drawn into a turning fight when Oscar. The Japanese fighters were notorious for baiting Allied pilots into dogfights, then using their superior maneuverability to get on their tail. Once an Oscar was behind you, escape was nearly impossible. The bombers, meanwhile, were well drilled in defensive gunnery, their tail and waist gunners ready to fill the sky with lead at the first sign of an attacker. The tactical situation was even worse than it appeared. The Japanese had timed their approach perfectly, using the morning sun to blind ground observers and mask their numbers. By the time Adair spotted them, the formation was already within striking distance. The anti-aircraft guns at Denjan were few and poorly positioned, designed more for harassment than defense. If the bombers reached the field, the destruction would be total. Fuel tanks would ignite, transports would be shredded, and the hospital would be left in ruins. Adair's options were brutally limited. He could try to shadow the formation, radio for help, and hope reinforcements arrived in time. But the Japanese would be over the target in minutes, and the nearest Allied fighters were still half an hour away. He could attack the bombers, but the Oscars would swarm him instantly. He could try to pick off stragglers, but with so many enemy fighters, even a single pass could be fatal. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion: survival was impossible. The doctrine said to wait, to live to fight another day. But Adair knew that if he did, Denjan would be lost, and with it, the hope of keeping China in the war. The enemy's strength was overwhelming, the odds unforgiving. Yet as the formation closed in, Adair's mind raced, not with thoughts of escape, but with a question that would define the next 17 minutes. Was there any way, any at all, to turn the impossible into a fighting chance? Adair knew he had only seconds to act. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Allison engine surge beneath him as he climbed above the bomber stream, using the sun at his back for a fleeting advantage. The Japanese formation was a machine, precise, relentless, and seemingly invulnerable. But machines could be broken. He rolled inverted, dove hard, and lined up on the lead Sally bomber. At 800 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The 6 Brownings roared, tracers stitching a line of fire across the bomber's left wing. Fabric tore, metal sparked, and the port engine erupted in flame. The formation shuddered, bombers scattering left and right, their tight V dissolving into chaos. But chaos cuts both ways. The Oscars reacted instantly, breaking from their escort positions and diving toward Adair in a deadly swarm. He pulled up, 7GS crushing him into his seat, and rolled right, tried to escape the converging fighters. The radio was alive with static and distant voices. No help, just a lonely sound of his own breathing and the rising whine of enemy engines. 2 Oscars flashed past his nose, guns blazing. He felt the P-40 shudder as rounds punched through the right wing, fabric tearing, metal buckling. The control stick went mushy in his hand. The aileron response was sluggish, but not gone. He dove again, using speed as his only shield. The bombers were trying to reform, 3 groups of 6 closing back into formation. Adair knew he had to keep them scattered, had to keep the pressure on, even as the odds closed in around him. He lined up on another Sally, fired a short burst, and saw the right engine explode in a fireball. The bomber rolled right, trailing smoke and debris, its wingmen breaking formation to avoid collision. But now 8 Oscars were on his tail, their machine guns stitching the air with deadly precision. Adair's fuel gauge dipped, his ammunition counter ticked down. The P-40 was taking damage, holes in the fuselage, aileron cables fraying, the engine temperature climbing dangerously high. He could feel the aircraft fighting him, every maneuver a battle against both the enemy and his own failing machine. The sky was a blur of tracers, smoke, and sunlight. The Japanese fighters circled above, waiting for him to make a mistake, to slow down, to become just another kill. For a moment, the hopelessness threatened to overwhelm him. He was alone, outnumbered, and running out of options. Every pass brought more damage. Every second in the air a miracle. The bombers were still closing on Denjan, and the Oscars showed no sign of letting up. Adair's world had shrunk to the cockpit, the controls, and the relentless pressure of survival. The odds were closing in, and the next hit could be his last. Smoke curled from the instrument panel as Adair yanked the P-40 into another desperate turn, the engine coughing and the right aileron barely responding. A burst of machine gun fire from an Oscar stitched across his wing, and suddenly the control stick went slack in his right hand. The aileron cable had snapped. The P-40 rolled sharply right, nose dropping toward the jungle below. For a split second, Adair fought panic. He had lost partial control of the aircraft, and the elevator felt heavy, unresponsive. The Warhawk was wounded, and so was he. His lungs burned from the smoke, his vision blurred at the edges, and the cockpit was filling with the acrid stench of burning oil and scorched wiring. Standard procedure was clear. Bail out, hope for rescue, and accept capture or death in the jungle. No one survived a crippled fighter with no control at low altitude, not with enemy fighters circling above and the ground rushing up. The manual offered no solutions for this. Doctrine said it was over, but Adair refused to accept the script that fate had written for him. He remembered a fragment from training, a throwaway line about how damage controls could sometimes be countered by flying inverted, using gravity and the reverse forces to compensate for lost authority. It was a theory, not a tactic. No one believed it was possible, let alone in combat, let alone with a burning engine and enemy guns still hunting. But Adair had no other options. He took a breath, gritted his teeth, and rolled the P-40 upside down. Instantly, the damaged aileron, which had been forcing the right wing down, now forced it up. The elevator, stuck in a nose-down trim, pushed the tail down and the nose up. The Warhawk, battered in trailing smoke, leveled out, fly inverted, just a few hundred feet above the jungle. The world flipped. Sky below, earth above, blood rushing to his head. The controls suddenly responsive in a way they hadn't been moments before. The Japanese pilot circling above saw the impossible. An American fighter, crippled and burning, refusing to crash, clawing for altitude by flying upside down. For a moment, they hesitated, unsure if it was a trick, a last act of defiance, or the madness of a man with nothing left to lose. Adair, for his part, felt the aircraft stabilize. The descent slowed. He was climbing, slowly, painfully, but climbing. The engine sputtered, the gauges danced in the red, but the P-40 held together. No one had ever tried this in combat. No manual, no instructor, no ace had ever suggested that a pilot could fly a damaged Warhawk home by alternating between inverted and upright flight, using the very damage that should have killed him as a tool for survival. But Adair was doing it, minute by minute, mile by mile, flipping the aircraft to gain altitude, rolling upright to let the engine breathe, then inverting again to keep from diving into the trees. The radio was silent. The Oscars circled, watching, perhaps in awe, perhaps in confusion. The bombers, scattered and leaderless, turned away from Denjan, their attack broken by the chaos below. Adair's gamble had bought precious time, disrupted the enemy's plan, and given the airfield a fighting chance. If you think you know how this ends, think again, because Adair's fight was far from over, and the most dangerous part of his journey was still ahead. Adair's world had turned upside down, literally. The P-40, battered and trailing smoke, hung inverted against the sky, the jungle rushing by beneath his canopy. Blood pounded in his head, pooling behind his eyes, but he forced himself to focus. Every instinct screamed that this was madness, that no pilot could fly a crippled fighter home upside down, but the alternative was certain death. The controls, so unresponsive moments before, now answered his touch with strange, inverted logic. The damaged aileron, which had nearly sent him spiraling into the trees, now helped him claw for altitude. The elevator, stuck in a nose-down trim, pushed the tail down and the nose up. For the first time since the attack began, Adair felt a sliver of hope. Above him, now below, in the inverted world, the Oscars circled warily. One pilot dove in for a closer look, perhaps thinking the American was finished, but Adair rolled upright, the P-40 shuddering as the airflow changed. The engine coughed, nearly quit, then caught again. The Japanese fighter broke away, unwilling to risk a head-on pass with a man who had already defied every expectation. The rest of the Oscars kept their distance, content to watch the spectacle unfold. They had seen many Allied pilots fall, but never one who refused to play by the rules of gravity and defeat. Adair's cockpit was a furnace. Smoke from the damaged engine filled the cramped space, burning his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open, letting the slipstream clear the worst of it, but the wind blast made breathing difficult. His vision tunneled, gray at the edges from carbon monoxide and the relentless negative GS. He checked his instruments, oil pressure at 0, coolant temperature off the scale, fuel gauge dropping fast. The Allison engine was running on borrowed time, every revolution a small miracle. He scanned the horizon, searching for familiar outline of Nagley Airfield. The radio was dead, shot out in the first pass. He was on his own, flying a dying plane, with no way to call for help or warn the ground crew of his approach. The only thing that mattered was keeping the P-40 in the air 1 mile at a time. The inverted flight was a delicate dance. Adair would hold the Warhawk upside down as long as the engine would run, gaining precious altitude, then roll upright to let the fuel system feed properly. Each time he rolled, the damaged controls threatened to send the nose plunging earthward. He learned to anticipate the moment, to time the roll, so that the nose would come up just as the engine sputtered, then flip back to inverted before losing too much height. It was a rhythm born of desperation, a pattern no instructor had ever taught. The ground below was a blur of green and brown, the jungle broken only by the thin silver ribbon of the river, and, finally, the the pale strip of the Nagali runway. Adair's heart leapt. He was close, but the hardest part was yet to come. The P-40's landing gear was hydraulic, powered by the engine. With so little power left, he doubted he could lower the gear in time. He reached for the manual pump, hands shaking from exhaustion and the effects of the smoke. He wrapped his lap belt around the stick to hold it steady, then pumped furiously, counting each stroke. 23, 24, 28. The gear thudded down, locking into place with a jolt that shook the whole airframe. But the flaps, also hydraulic, refused to budge. He would have to land fast, with no margin for error. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, the propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The P-40 became a glider, heavy and unresponsive, bleeding altitude with every second. Adair rolled inverted one last time, eking out a few more feet of altitude, then righted the plane as he lined up with the runway. On the ground, the crew at Nagali saw the impossible. A P-40, gear down, trailing smoke, approaching at high speed, upside down. For a moment, they thought it was a Japanese trick, a captured plane coming in to strafe the field. Gunners manned their positions, fingers on the triggers, but hesitated as the Warhawk rolled upright, wings wobbling, nose high. Adair fought the controls, every muscle straining to keep the wings level. The damaged elevator gave him only partial authority. The aileron barely responded, and the airspeed was dangerously high. He crossed the threshold at 90 feet, too fast, too steep. The main wheels slammed into concrete, the right gear collapsing on impact. The P-40 ground looped, spinning in a shower of sparks and debris, skidding backward for 200 feet before coming to a shuddering halt. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Adair, dazed and shaking, released his harness and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled, but he caught himself, standing atop the battered Warhawk as ground crew raced toward him. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment, the air thick with the smell of burning oil and scorched metal. The crew stared in disbelief at the bullet holes, the collapsed gear, the shattered canopy, and the pilot who had brought home a plane that should never have flown again. The Japanese formation, denied its prize, turned back toward Burma, their bombs undropped, their mission in ruins. Adair had done the impossible, not just surviving, but saving the airfield, the transports, and the fragile lifeline that kept China in the fight. In those 17 minutes, he had rewritten the rules of air combat, proving that sometimes the difference between disaster and victory is a refusal to give in no matter how hopeless the odds. And as he stood on the wing of his ruined P-40, the reality of what he had accomplished began to sink in, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed the day one pilot turned impossible into history. The dust had barely settled on the Nagali runway when the ground crew reached Adair's battered P-40. For a moment, no one spoke. Mechanics and medics stared in disbelief at the aircraft that should have been a smoking wreck in the jungle. The Warhawk's right wing was gouged and torn, the landing gear twisted and collapsed, the engine compartment scorched and leaking. Bullet holes riddled the fuselage and wings, and the cockpit still reeked of smoke and burning oil. Yet, impossibly, the plane and its pilot had made it home. Adair, pale and unsteady, was helped down from the wing. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. The medics checked him for wounds, expecting the worst, but aside from bruises and a deep fatigue, he was intact. The crew chief, Sergeant Martinez, walked a slow circle around Lulu Bell, counting the damage. 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. The right aileron cable was severed, the hydraulic reservoir punctured, and the engine was a ruined mass of warped metal and scorched wiring. Lulu Bell would never fly again. As word spread across the airfield, pilots, mechanics, and officers gathered around the wrecked Warhawk. The initial shock gave way to awe as the story unfolded. How Adair had faced 64 enemy aircraft alone, how he had disrupted the bomber formation, and how he had flown a crippled plane home by alternating between inverted and upright flight. The impossible had happened before their eyes. Meanwhile, reports filtered in from Denjan and other nearby fields. Not a single bomb had fallen on the airfield. The Japanese formation, thrown into chaos by Adair's attack, had scattered and turned back, their mission a failure. The transport was safe, the hospital untouched, and the vital supply line to China remained open. What had been expected, a devastating loss, the destruction of the airfield, and the loss of countless lives, had been averted by the actions of one pilot. In the days that followed, Adair's feat became legend among the Burma Banshees and throughout the theater. What was supposed to be a day of certain defeat had become a story of survival, ingenuity, and the power of refusing to accept the inevitable. The airfield, the squadron, and the entire Allied effort in China owed their survival to a pilot who had dared to do the unthinkable. In the quiet that followed the chaos, Adair's story became more than just a tale of survival. It became a testament to the spirit that defined the Burma Banshees and so many unsung heroes of World War II. His courage to defy the odds, to trust instinct and ingenuity when every rule said to give up, was a reminder that history is often shaped not by the overwhelming force of numbers, but by the determination of individuals who refuse to surrender. Adair's inverted flight was more than a desperate maneuver. It was a symbol of creative problem-solving under fire, of turning disaster into opportunity when the world expects defeat. The legacy of the Burma Banshees lives on in stories like this. Stories of pilots and ground crews who face impossible missions with grit, resourcefulness, and a fierce loyalty to one another. They were ordinary men asked to do extraordinary things, and time and again they rose to the challenge. Their victories were not always measured in enemy planes shot down, but in lives saved, mission completed, and hope kept alive in the darkest hours. For those who hear this story today, it's a call to remember that heroism isn't always about medals or headlines. Sometimes it's about a single moment of decision, a refusal to accept defeat, and the courage to try the unthinkable. Adair's flight reminds us that even when the odds seem insurmountable, one person's resolve can change the course of history. That's why this story matters. It's not just about a pilot and his plane. It's about the enduring power of human will, the value of thinking differently, and the importance of honoring those who fought not just with weapons, but with heart and mind. The skies over Assam may be quiet now, but the legacy of that day, and of those who refuse to quit, deserves to be remembered by all who value courage and ingenuity. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold tales of courage and ingenuity from World War II. Share your thoughts or family stories in the comments. Your voice helps keep these memories alive. Don't let these forgotten heroes fade into history. Every story matters, and together we can make sure they're never lost. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next incredible account of bravery against impossible odds. There are more hidden stories waiting to be discovered, and you won't want to miss what comes next.